The last time I was with you, we looked at a passage in the Christian Bible written by the Apostle Paul. Now, he's someone who gets mixed reviews among thinkers of our current era. Some people love him while others think that he's just full of hot air. I happen to be among those who want to kick him in the kneecap sometimes. But as I said last time, there may be a lesson in what he says that we can all stand to be reminded of, no matter how our theology differs from Paul's. So last time we looked at 1 Corinthians 8, where Paul was telling the Christians in Corinth that we all possess knowledge, but knowledge puffs up while love builds up. In that letter, Paul encouraged his readers not to allow the exercise of our own spiritual freedom to become an impediment to people who do not have the same freedom we do. He says that if we're not careful, some people might actually be damaged by our knowledge when we forget to serve it up with a side of love. This is something Paul expounds upon a few chapters later in 1 Corinthians 13, when he reiterates this critical piece of insight about spiritual pride. He said, "If I speak in the tongues of men or of angels, but do not have love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy, and if I have all knowledge, and if I have all faith that can move mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing." Imagine for a moment that I asked you to come to my house for dinner because I knew that you were hungry. But then when you got to my house, I served you a meal and then left you in the kitchen to enjoy the meal by yourself because, look, I have so much work to do and I just don't have time to sit around and visit. Suddenly, the meal would mean nothing to you. It's just a meaningless handout that might even make you feel worse about yourself, to be honest. Yet this is what many people think that they should do. Go to church, be nice to people, work in the soup kitchen, tell people that they matter, but not actually engage with people who need more than a handout. This is missing the point. It's when I sit down and ask you to pass me the rolls and inquire about your family and ask you about your advice on what color to paint the kitchen. That's when we begin to experience relationship building. This is when you start to recognize that my concern is authentic. And this is when you'll start being interested in what I have to say. Spiritual pride comes in other forms too. Some folks like to demonstrate the magnitude of their spiritual cunning by answering every conceivable hardship with pithy little quotes. You might recognize some of these. Everything happens for a reason. What goes around comes around. Everything will work out the way it's supposed to. Forgive and forget. Don't take life so seriously. Don't worry, there's nothing you can do about it anyway. The problem is these quotes don't actually help. Some of them might be true, or they might not, but in the end, they are just witty little band-aids that only insult a person's wounded heart. It's kind of like that old fable that I just read about the north wind and the sun who compete to see who can make a passing traveler remove his coat. The north wind went first, blowing with all its might, trying to force the coat off the man's back. But the harder the wind blew, the tighter the man pulled his coat around him. He turned his back on the wind, hiding his face from the onslaught of blowing objects. The more the wind tried, the more the man resisted. Finally, when it was the sun's turn, it shone down gently. The traveler lifted his face to the sky and was comforted by the warmth of the sun. Eventually, he removed his coat willingly. Oftentimes, we do whatever we can to force people into thinking or feeling the way we think they should. We pummel them with logic, reason, and common sense. We tell them to be realistic, to get with the program. We read them scripture verses or quotes from wise authors. If they're older than we are, we might tell them to try to keep up with the times. If they're younger than we are, we might tell them stories about the way things were when we were their age. But the more we try to force our way of thinking on them, the more they just turn their backs and hide their faces from us. They pull their coats tighter and protect themselves from the onslaught of coercion. I believe we would do better with the approach that the son took in this ancient fable. Instead of coercion, we could offer conversation. We could listen to where they're coming from and then find out how we can best help along their journey. Only then will they turn their faces our way. You might even find that they drop their defenses, remove their coat, and really start to open up to us. This can be especially difficult when someone we care about is experiencing some sort of pain. We often feel so uncomfortable around other people's pain that we try to think of something, anything, to say that will make them feel better. But we must be careful that we're not offering these words for selfish reasons, simply because we feel uncomfortable seeing them in pain. And we should also be sure that we're not just trying to fill up empty space with words so that we don't feel helpless. In the Old Testament story of Job, 3 friends gathered around him to try to help him find answers for all the hardship he was facing. They all spoke to Job based on their best experience of God, their best theology at work. They said that God is always faithful to the righteous and punishes the wicked. They were sure that there was some sort of wrongdoing in Job's life to anger God in such a way. They really wanted to help Job get to the bottom of things so he could turn his life around. Or maybe they just felt helpless and they were trying to think of something to say that might help. But then in Job 38, we see God becoming very upset with Job's friends. God said, "Who are these people who obscure my plans using words without knowledge?" Job's friends were using a lot of words that sounded very religious and holy, but in the end, delivering an absolute load of bunk. These men were speaking in absolutes that weren't worth the air that it took to speak them. A few years ago, Parker Palmer was interviewed on public radio about his struggles with depression. He said this, and I'm going to quote, "I had folks coming to me, of course, who wanted to be helpful, and sadly, many of them weren't. These were the people who would say, 'Gosh, Parker, why are you sitting in here being so depressed? It's a beautiful day outside. Go feel the sunshine and smell the flowers.' And that, of course, leaves a depressed person feeling even more depressed, because while you know intellectually that it's sunny out and that the flowers are lovely and fragrant, you can't really feel any of that in your body, which is dead in a sensory way. And so you're left more depressed by the good advice to get you out and to enjoy the day." There was this one friend who came to me after asking permission to do so every afternoon about 4 o'clock, sat me down in a chair in the living room, took off my shoes and socks, and massaged my feet. He hardly ever said anything. And yet, out of his intuitive sense, from time to time, would say a very brief word like, "I can feel your struggle today." Or further on down the road, "I feel you're a little stronger at this moment, and I'm glad for that." But beyond that, he would hardly say anything. He would give no advice. He would simply report from time to time what he was intuiting about my condition. Somehow he found the one place in my body, namely the soles of my feet, where I could experience some sort of connection to another human being. And the act of massaging just in a way that I really don't have words for, kept me connected with the human race. How many of us are tempted to rush in with a brilliant reframe? At least you have your health, and that's the most important thing. Or so many people have it worse than we do. In short, how many of us are so afraid of watching loved ones suffer that we bludgeon them with our positive energy? Little Justin was 4 years old, and he was terrified of thunderstorms. One night he was staying with his grandfather, who tucked him into bed just as a thunderstorm was rolling through. After a loud crack of thunder, Justin snuck out of bed and made his way down to the den where his grandfather was reading. "I'm scared," he said, and his grandfather turned around in his chair. "Don't worry, Justin," he said. "You'll be all right. Just remember that God is with you." "I know," Justin cried, "but I need someone with skin on." Sometimes I believe that we find ourselves in people's lives, not to give them wise words of wisdom, but just to be there, love with skin on. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul says something very interesting, and I'll paraphrase it in this way. He says, "Though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself like a slave to everyone. To the Jews, I became like a Jew. To traditionalists, I became like one who follows tradition. To the weak, I become weak. I have become different things to different people so that by all means possible, I might help some." Now, this is pretty easy to follow Paul's train of thought for the most part. It's a familiar concept. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. But then we get to the weakness part. To the weak, I became weak. So how does that work? Wouldn't it be better to offer strength to the weak? Isn't that what I would want when I'm feeling exhausted, when I'm depressed, when I'm worried, when I'm lonely, when I'm scared? Don't I want someone to offer me strength? Wouldn't it do more harm than good if I were to make myself weak to join someone else in their weakness? A very dear friend of mine tells the story of a time when she was working as a chaplain in a hospital, long before the days of COVID when social distancing changed the face of chaplaincy. Lisa says that she was called to the emergency room around midnight one evening. A woman had found her 17-year-old son dead in his bedroom. Death by suicide. The boy had been taken to the morgue and the mother had been brought to the emergency room. Lisa wrote about the encounter in this way. "As I walked into the department, I heard terrible screams and wailing. The emergency staff gave me looks of pity as I walked by. The looks seemed to say, 'I'm glad it's you going in there and not me.' I knocked on the woman's door and the nurse opened. Relief washed over his face as he left. The screaming woman didn't notice the change of guard. An ER tech sat beside the patient, nervously rubbing the mother's arm and trying to get her to calm down, while I just stood quietly at the woman's feet. After a few minutes, the tech turned to me and said she just couldn't take it anymore and promptly left the room. I moved a chair next to the bed and said nothing as she thrashed around her bed with the pain that was ripping her heart out. She looked at me and she screamed the images that were burned into her mind. Every once in a while, I would gently echo her. 'He was too young. You love him with your life.' She continued to scream, and I understood. I felt no compulsion to quiet her for my own comfort. I observed my inner voice calmly reassuring both of us. 'I am not afraid of your pain.' I was here to companion the terror of this mortally wounded woman. I needed to take off my shoes, for I realized we were both being held within the holy. Gandhi said, "It is better to have a heart without words than words without a heart." When someone is traumatized by the enormity of a painful situation, they don't need a show of strength to make them feel better. The woman in the hospital bed didn't need a nurse standing over her saying that everything would be okay. She didn't need a chaplain coming in to tell her that time heals all wounds, or that God loves her and wants her to be strong for her child that is lost. Love and compassion are critical at a time like this. She needed to feel the anguish. She needed someone who would recognize her terror and stand there with her, facing it head on, while her mouth went dry from the screams. Theodore Roosevelt once said, "People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care." So many of us think that we have to know what to say when people face the storms of life. We're looking for solid formulas, brilliant advice, pithy quotes, or maybe even magic wands that will help us come up with just the right words of wisdom for the people that we minister to. The finest words of wisdom I've heard so far were spoken by Winnie the Pooh, who said, "It is more fun to talk with someone who doesn't use long, difficult words, but rather short, easy words like, 'What about lunch?' Instead of trying to teach people how to live or what to believe, it's far better to listen and discover where they are in their life, and then to offer conversation instead of coercion." In closing, allow me to share a version of a story that I heard years ago. I don't know where it came from, but as I read it recently, I thought about the war going on right now in Ukraine. I'm going to take some liberties with the story to modernize it to our current context. A group of Ukrainian soldiers secretly made their way down the broken stairs to the basement of a bombed out apartment complex. The smell almost knocked them backwards as they approached. It was the smell of humans holding on to life by any means possible. The soldiers were there to extract survivors from the latest onslaught of Russian missiles, and they knew that people had been hiding there for weeks just trying to survive. As soon as they reached the dark, filthy room where the civilians were, they stormed through the door and found them curled up tightly on the floor. The soldiers yelled at them, "We are Ukrainian soldiers and we're here to rescue you." The soldiers urgently demanded that the civilians follow before the building succumbed to its weakened state. But the stunned civilians would not budge. You see, they didn't believe that the soldiers were really Ukrainian. They had been tricked before. "Glory to Ukraine," the soldiers shouted, hoping that the huddled group would recognize their authenticity. But the people didn't move. They just stayed huddled in the corner, hiding their eyes. They had trusted soldiers in the past who had violently turned on them. They had already paid a great price for their trust, and they were not going to let it happen again. If they just stayed still, maybe the soldiers would go away and leave them alone to die in peace. The soldiers didn't know what to do. The building wasn't safe, but there was no way they could carry all these people out of there. Finally, one of the soldiers had an idea. He put down his weapon, took off his helmet, walked over to the civilians and curled up next to them. He put his arms down around them, softened his facial expressions, and just talked quietly. He became one of them. He stayed there for a while until some of the civilians started looking at him. Russian soldiers would not have done this. Then the soldier shared his message again. We are Ukrainian soldiers and we are here to rescue you. Will you follow us? With that, he stood to his feet, and one by one, the civilians did the same. They were ready. They were ready to trust again. When we are weak and scared, is it always strength that we want? No. Sometimes what we really want is someone who will huddle in the corner with us in our weakness and talk softly until we're ready to get up. Someone who will stand by our side when we can't find the strength to face the world, and who holds our hands as we scream. Sometimes silence is the best gift that we can offer to someone. When we put our own beliefs aside, we can be present with them right where they are. Just as love became one of us, we are called to take off our helmets, put aside our weapons, and just be there for each other. Love with skin on. And then only use words when necessary. Though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself like a slave to everyone. To the Jews, I became like a Jew. To traditionalists, I became like one who follows tradition. To the weak, I became weak. I have become different things to different people so that by all means possible, I may help some. People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Thank you.